Okay, so I think that we are now live. Yes, I've got the signal that we're now live. Welcome everyone, wherever you might be joining us from, whether it might be morning, early afternoon or late afternoon, welcome. Of course, we're all here today to launch a wonderful collection published by ICES, I've hopefully said that right, or the Yusof Ishak Institute. And this is the book here that we are launching today, From Grassroots Activism to Disinformation, Social Media in Southeast Asia. I'm the chair of the discussion today. My name's Amelia Johns. I'm a senior lecturer at UTS Sydney School of Communication. And my research looks at youth digital citizenship and activism in Malaysia and Australia. And I've also started to look at disinformation, particularly on WhatsApp. But this collection that we're launching is edited, of course, by Aim Sin Peng, who you'll be able to see here, and Ross Tapsell. Aim is a lecturer at Sydney University and Thailand country coordinator for the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. Ross is senior lecturer at ANU and director of the ANU Malaysia Institute. The book also has contributions from 10 other established and emerging scholars from across the region. I finished reading the chapters over the weekend and can certainly say without hesitation that this book will become essential reading for those of us working on social media and internet research in Southeast Asia. In terms of its central themes, the book explores a sweeping paradigm shift from the introduction of social media in the region, where it was first adopted by pro-democracy activists and opposition figures, also disenfranchised citizens, to connect and challenge authoritarian regime power arrangements in the region and to democratize media. But we've seen that come 360 to more recent developments where the state has wrested back control, it seems, and is gaining electoral advantage through manipulating social media publics via disinformation campaigns. And there's some chapters in this collection which look at the influence of cyber troopers, bots and influencers that of course are supporting regimes, authoritarian and semi-authoritarian regimes. In terms of the contribution I think this book will make, we all are producing and reading articles that trace these impacts within particular nation states, sometimes around specific elections. But the beauty of this collection is that it brings together scholars from across the region who report very similar developments while highlighting those individual histories and nuances. So it allows researchers to see the larger picture, if you like, in terms of these developments. And of course, we also have seen that this research is conducted largely in Europe, US, Australia as well, and not enough attention comes to this region. So it's a fantastic collection, and I'm sure there'll be information at the end of the launch as to how you can get your hands on this book. But without too much further ado, I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask Ross and Aim to lead off the discussion today. But of course, I'd also like you to drop your questions that you may have in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. And I'm going to ask a couple of questions, then come to the Q&A and hopefully share some of your questions with Ross and Aim. So don't be shy. Do pose your questions as we're chatting. But the first question I'd like to pose perhaps to Ross today. Very interested to hear your thoughts about what led you to bring together and edit this collection right now with AIM. And what is the answer, do you think, to the question that you pose in the introductory chapter? What went wrong? When did we slide from social media being an activist tool to it being a tool of disinformation, often used on behalf of the state?
Oh, thanks, Amelia, for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for turning up to our virtual online launch. Thanks to my co-editor, AIM, and all the contributors who did a wonderful job putting together country-specific chapters, and also an overview chapter by Marco Buonte, who talked about the democratic decline in Southeast Asia and the connection to social media. And I guess that's in part one way to start answering your question, Amelia, this reduction in the health of the digital public sphere is something that we thought was urgently worth writing about for two reasons. One is obviously political science scholars are talking a lot about democratic decline globally, and Southeast Asia, of course, is part of that. But another part is the specific nature or the local contextual context of Southeast Asia and why that matters. And first, it's this rise of state-sponsored disinformation, which is really growing. And second is the response that the state or state laws or regulations that have been created in order to so-called absolve the problem or try and solve the problem of disinformation. So on the one hand, you've got often the state being and the governments being the largest complainants of fake news and disinformation. At the same time, the biggest growth in disinformation comes from the state itself. So we thought that was worth writing about. But the more tricky answer, the more tricky question is where did it all go wrong? Where did we start to see this, as we call it, from grassroots activism to disinformation? Of course, it's not as simple as, being wonderful and then being bad, but, it's good to have a title that at least tries to frame that question. And AIM can jump in here, but I guess we were trying to get authors to fix on a tipping point of where did it start to go wrong? Where did we start to see social media being a prominent case for bad actors in the region, not a space for reformists? And yeah, AIM might want to jump in here and see where that answer was.
Well, the answer, thank you again for having me. The answer is usually related to elections, right? When elections come, it's when political elites realize that social media is not just a tool for fun where young people go and goof around online, or that people do selfies on, or listen to K-pop artists, but it's actually a critical tool for political opposition mobilization, especially. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this book now is that it's been a decade since the Arab Spring, and Southeast Asia has not had its Arab Spring or its spring, right? And Southeast Asia as a region has always been sort of an exception to the rule when it comes to theories such as democratization, where you don't see a particular wave of countries, democratizing or what have you. So it's been a decade since the Arab Spring. We didn't have our spring, and it doesn't look like there is a clear pattern as to how exactly social media has impacted politics in the country and what is the variation across countries. So this is our attempt to really get to the bottom of really understanding exactly what role does social media play, and to capture the time when social media entered the country in the region, and that time varies. And I think people forget that. People think, oh yeah, we're all just gonna have our smartphones and Facebook all at the same time, but it's actually not true at all. It's actually quite staggered. The evolution of social media in the country is uneven, even within the country. And so it's really one of the surprising findings that our contributors have shown to us was that the turning point came around at the same time in the mid-2010s, and usually revolving around a major election, even though social media arrive in each of the country at very different times. Somehow that had the same momentous effect or a trigger for political elites to start to get serious about social media's role at around the same time, even though, for places like Singapore, where it had been available en masse for more than a decade before, for example, in Myanmar. And yet what has happened in 2010 is that suddenly, especially when an incumbent either lost an election or nearly lost an election, they realized we've got to do something about social media. And this is when we're starting to see the turning point.
Yeah, it's interesting, as you mentioned, the staggered kind of development of internet histories across the different regions, the introduction of social media and the popularity of some platforms over others within different national contexts hasn't kind of changed that overarching theme of this has still happened. It's been a democratizing influence, but that's always balanced against the use or the kind of weaponization, if you like, of social media by nation states. So, I mean, having said that, I suppose that neat arc that Ross spoke about, from grassroots activism to disinformation, you know, as you mentioned, it's not quite that neat. And there are, as we've seen recently in Thailand, there are kind of movements, activist movements, youth movements that are kind of really using social media to question some of these arrangements of power, even to challenge the monarchy in Thailand. And, you know, that has kind of been seen as an institution that hasn't been challenged previously. So is there hope that social media can still be a democratizing technology, that it's not just heading towards a disinformation tool? And I might pose that to AIM first of all.
I'll briefly mention two things and then Ross can add. One is that it's not that we think that there is a linear progression across the board, but we do see an overarching theme that for whatever reason, when social media originally came in each country, regardless of type of political system, even in the most repressive system like, you know, Vietnam, the political elites were not going hard on censorship on cyberspace. Across the board, even in Myanmar, especially, even though, you know, you did have accounts of the military being very war at the time, the level, there's still some degree of freedom. And especially if you compare the freedom of cyberspace to other types of media, this is the most liberal space still, even today in all these countries. So there is sort of some pattern, there is a regional pattern that political elites, while, you know, having heard about what happened in Arab Spring, normally pretty repressive when it comes to censorship on traditional media, somehow left the cyberspace a little bit more open. And that gave, you know, a lot more breathing room for the emergence of all kinds of civic activism, including political activism, until they realized that this has real serious implications on their regime. That's one thing, that despite, you know, all of this, the cyberspace is still more liberal than any other traditional media space. But secondly, it's a highly contested space, and Thailand is a perfect example of this. Thailand has still today one of the most repressive internet regime in the world, let alone the region. And the region is, you know, largely authoritarian, right? This is not a region of vibrant democracy whatsoever, and yet you still see social media enabling the emergence of youth activists, youth protester at a time of pandemic, right? And so I think what Thailand, as an example, has shown a number of things. One is an extremely highly contested space, and the fact that the state has engineered new institutions to clamp down information freedom and what have you, it still may not work, right? So in fact, right before this youth movement kind of emerged, there was a new anti-fake news agency in Thailand, precisely set up to try to dampen political opposition. This is another one, right? Thailand, in fact, had, as early as 2006, legislated a new computer crime law just to crack down on this. That's, you know, 14 years ago. And yet you still see cyberspace giving rise to quite unprecedented youth movement. So in some ways, what Thailand has shown is that the increase in cyber repression doesn't necessarily mean that it completely killed activism. In fact, it could just show that what the state has attempted to control may not be so effective. That doesn't mean that it's not there. That doesn't mean that disinformation isn't being used as a tool for information control. It just means that it may not be that effective, or it could just mean, in the Thailand case, I fully believe it just means that political elites are completely out of touch with what's going on with youth culture online. They have no clue what's going on. They may design new institutions, new laws, coming up with new ways to try to control information. But ultimately, it's really truly understand what is it that people, especially young people, do online that could get them to, if they really increase censorship, really better understand in cyberspace.
Okay, we have a couple of questions, but maybe Ross, if you just want to, first of all, add your insights there to what AIM has mentioned. I mean, I think it's interesting also to speak about the intervention of platforms in the uprising in Thailand, for example. Is that something that you might be able to speak to, Ross?
Yeah, well, we tried to challenge the authors to say how can reformists and activists and democratic advancement, how can they use cyberspace or reclaim cyberspace and social media for that purpose? I think it's a huge challenge. It raises questions of, should everyone get off Facebook and find a new platform? Do we need to lobby in Silicon Valley, or is it really the biggest problems are locally in the way that local governments are handling the so-called rise of fake news? And in many ways, the reaction from Southeast Asian governments is a response to tech platforms in America sitting on their hands, not being particularly concerned until more recently with what was going on in Southeast Asia, because it was just a big market which allowed for growth, and they didn't have enough people who spoke local languages who were able to crack down or who were able to identify and then take down that kind of disinformation, which they're now trying to address. And the Myanmar election is one example of that, where they've just put in much more resources in that space. But it is a challenge to think about how to reclaim that space to be a space for reform. And I won't give away all the answers that all our authors gave, because I still want you to buy the book. But it's really interesting to look at it in each local context. And each country in Southeast Asia, all the chapters are organized by country, and each country author lives in Southeast Asia. They're local Southeast Asian researchers. They're at local universities predominantly. And so they've really tried to give their response from the sort of decade that they've been working on this. And it really does vary. As you can imagine, Vietnam's digital space is very different from Indonesia's. But all of the authors do try to give an answer as to the role that tech platforms play, but also a local contextual answer as well.
Great, thank you, Ross and AIM. We do have quite a few questions that have come through now, so I might just read through these and you can respond as you wish. Select who responds to these. The first question is from Egbert Witz, wondering whether laws regulating social media use in Indonesia, a new ITE law introduced in 2016 came about, were introduced in all Southeast Asian countries, and whether there's a great variance in what these laws are trying to regulate or make punishable. So basically wondering whether laws regulating social media use that have been introduced in many Southeast Asian countries are having an impact.
Yeah, so I'll do the sort of island Southeast Asian. AIM can speak about mainland, but certainly the Undang-Undang ITE in Indonesia has been hugely problematic. Initially created, I think, in 2008, before social media really, was prominent. They weren't thinking about, Twitter and WhatsApp when they created the ITE law. Indonesia doesn't have an anti-fake news law the way that Singapore and Malaysia initially tried to create one. They've just used an existing law. And unfortunately, it's become highly politicized, particularly around election times. We saw, really prominent use of the law to crack down on those who were criticizing the president, sometimes justifiably. There were fake news being spread, but it was all very one-sided in terms of the amount which was which the police were investigating. And this is the danger with all these laws, POFMA in Singapore, anti-fake news law in Malaysia, whatever it might be. They clearly are too easily able to be manipulated for the ruling power to crack down on those, or to at least try to limit the information of those who, or the spreading of information of those who might criticize them. And so in the case of Indonesia, we've also seen laws where activists have been used to crack down on that space. Sorry, Aim's just having an emergency.
Yeah, we've got Bob taking part here. So perhaps while Aim's tending to Bob, Ross, the next question is from Emma Renciana. And they say, with regards to the recent US post-election, how do the panelists compare any Southeast Asian countries to the democratic state of USA? You know, what kind of comparisons can you see in terms of probably the way disinformation spread?
Yeah, there was a study, I think, in the US saying that the biggest spreader of misinformation and disinformation was Trump himself, which makes perfect sense. Of course it would be when you just look at his Twitter feed. So yeah, Trump has in many ways changed the landscape of the way that a leader would engage with social media. Thankfully, we haven't seen as direct approach to that, but this populism, including via social media, is certainly a growing trend in Southeast Asia. And we've seen, you know, of course, Rodrigo Duterte, probably the most famous example of that in the Philippines. But plenty of ministers, and COVID has given a great example of that, of ministers who might get up and say they've got a miracle cure, or say, you know, you just need to pray, or, you know, putting out misinformation. And part of that problem is also journalism, in the way that, in particular, well, in Southeast Asia, often it's about reporting on what elites are saying, but that's very true also in the West. You know, the American media has had to rethink the way that they might report on Trump's tweets. And then Twitter itself has had to rethink how it now says this is all disputed. So we're in an incredibly disruptive time, which allows, I guess, allows for this is why it's so urgent to discuss some of these matters.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got those questions coming in now, which is great. Please continue to drop your questions in the Q&A. But just, I guess, extending on the last point that you made, Ross, a lot of the chapters written in this collection would have been based on research that came before the pandemic really became a big game changer, I guess. The World Health Organization, of course, has made reference to the way that disinformation spreads have kind of increased. They're referring to it as an infodemic or a disinfodemic. Do you think that this is a problem that's sweeping through Southeast Asia? Is that reflected in the research? I think there was Natalie's chapter who did make reference to COVID misinformation. But just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to what the landscape looks like now, you know, during a pandemic. And do you think platform operators are quicker to take down health disinformation as opposed to political disinformation, which is always a very contentious thing to do?
I can maybe speak a little bit to that for mainland Southeast Asia. And COVID-19 has really interesting impacts on the contestation over facts and truth in each society, and it's not what we expected at all. I think, you know, with many of the Southeast Asian countries, not all, have done quite well in managing the pandemic. Part of the credit has gone to the government, and part of that was an attempt for governments to communicate better to their citizens. So in fact, some states like Vietnam, for example, that roll out an app where it's, you know, basically asking for input from citizens if they have heard of information that could be potentially false, to verify with a state agency, has done quite extremely well in getting not just people downloading the app, but getting participation, right? So increased actual participation in fighting hoax and finding potential misinformation. And the reverse happened in Thailand, where that anti-fake news agency was set up, and it's not been quite well used at all. So and so in some ways, there isn't a correlation between how well the governments have managed the pandemic and how much goodwill the governments have actually gained in terms of providing information, or in terms of rectifying potential misinformation. So I still think that in general, if the COVID-19 it's not necessarily the problem of misinformation, is that it has better highlight the role the government play in providing information to the public for both good and bad, but it's also highlighting how important it is for the government to want participation from people, to basically to be more aware of misinformation, but also to provide input into either state-run agency that try to deal with disinformation, or other types of tools like an app that the state government has come up with.
Ross, if you might want to add to that.
Yeah, I think the big thing that everybody's got to be thinking about, and hopefully the book at least tries to point us in that direction, is first, as there are criticisms towards certain policies in any country, but obviously the book's focusing on Southeast Asia, how can the digital infrastructure be manipulated to promote to sort of promote good news about countries and their handling of COVID-19, which glosses over some of the urgent policy decisions which are not being made. So there's this sort of, we call them cyber troopers in Malaysia, buzzers in Indonesia, trolls in the Philippines. And the rise of these, this digital labor is really important to understand, because at first we used to think of this as just an election time phenomenon. This is where the money would flow, right? Pre-election campaign, you'd hire these laborers, and then once the election is over, everybody sort of went back to their normal PR jobs, or went back to being university students, or whatever it might be. And now they're thinking, actually, these are really useful tools. We're going to keep them on in between elections to negate potential criticism, and in order to manipulate or to shape the flow of discourse online. So can we even trust a trending Twitter topic anymore? Can we even trust online sentiment or social media sentiment that we, scholars have so long, tried to use when they examine Twitter? Now that this is such a prominent practice in Southeast Asia. And so when it comes to COVID, when we think about like the rollout of a vaccine, or the link between an American created vaccine versus a Chinese created vaccine, and how disinformation industry may influence that, and also whether people will trust, wherever it's from, whether people will actually trust the vaccine. So much of that will come down to how they engage with their so-called filter bubbles or echo chambers, and how much of this is a really healthy digital public sphere that people are engaging with, and that's what we need to be thinking about, and certainly in the urgent, as we head into 2021.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. And I think also this, there's a big focus, obviously, in the collection on organised disinformation campaigns, top-down campaigns, but also there's the problem of misinformation. And I've certainly, research I've done on WhatsApp shows that rumour and gossip, and Ross, you've written about this too, rumour and gossip can flow from multiple directions and flow through social media channels like WhatsApp. Aegis asks the question from Jakarta, how far is people's literacy, their digital literacy, which is still very poor, is that actually a consequence of social media usage in Indonesia and across these regions? Is social media and the platforms and the way they work, their business models, is that to blame for people's poor literacy in spreading misinformation?
yeah, Aim, do you want to talk about the rise of social media in places like Cambodia and Myanmar, and just from going from, you know, almost no internet access to that? I thought that was a really interesting aspect of the authors who wrote for the book.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I was like, the question was about Indonesia, but yes,
Oh, yeah, sorry.
In Cambodia and Myanmar too, where and actually Laos as well, which we didn't cover. That, you know, all of a sudden you have social media and you get Chinese phones that and the price of a SIM card dramatically dropped, and what that has meant. And both authors in a volume that address Myanmar and Cambodia did agree that there seems to be an issue with digital literacy and the speed and people were able to access information without really understanding, you know, just basic literacy, this computer literacy. Well, it's not through computers, it's through phones. And how fertile the attempts at increasing the has been. But they've also known that, you know, people across the board, not just people who are quote unquote less educated, succumb to misinformation. And this is particularly Myanmar, where the contributor, the author, actually looks quite closely the radical Buddhist extremist groups that have been at the heart of the conflict relating to the Rohingya, and how the followers and people who supported this group are not necessarily people who are less educated. So in some ways, on the one hand, the way social media arrive at some of these countries, especially the late arrival one, right? The one that came late, but came really quickly and spread it really fast, present it also happened in states that already have problems with political division and political instability. So it's not clear exactly, you know, whether you fix the literacy problem.
Yeah, it's always the answer that people give is this idea of, oh, if, you know, digital literacy is the solution to the problem, and certainly states are now, well, some states are really pushing that, but yeah, it's in some cases there's no digital literacy programs in schools, but hopefully that's what, you know, this kind of work at least contributes to. The more we call out fake news and discuss it, the better people will be able to identify it. The difference, I think, for a literacy program, not to go on too long on this, but we have the old school media literacy has always been about like criticizing media and mainstream media political communications, right? Media ownership. The Murdoch press is owned by Rupert Murdoch, which means it's going to be pushing the Liberal Party agenda in Australia and America and so on, the right-wing agenda, and therefore we've got to critique mass media, which is fine. That's an important part of a media literacy program. Now we're at the stage really where a lot of people don't trust any form of media or any form of professional journalism. And so we as part of this digital literacy idea, we need to be thinking about how do we get people to understand and identify quality and reliable news and information, not just say, oh, all the media is biased, all the media is unprofessional, and therefore I don't trust any of it, and I'm only going to trust what sort of comes through on my WhatsApp page or my Facebook page, WhatsApp group or my Facebook page. And that's where we need to think about literacy programs shifting from media literacy to digital literacy.
Thanks, Ross. I'll try and move through some of these questions that have been posed in the QA, but there are quite a few now, so we might not be able to make it through all of those. But Gayatri, and I hope that I haven't mispronounced your name, asks, while states would want more control, you know, it's probably an impossible endeavour for them to have full control over digital infrastructure. Of course it is, because they're private entities that run those infrastructures. So in reality, maybe they just want to cause a chilling effect to suppress, you know, political dissent, opposition voices, etc. Is at the same time as keeping the digital economy flowing. So Gayatri asks if you have any thoughts on that.
Thanks for that question, Gayatri. Good to see you joining us. Definitely, and that's actually the reason why Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand themselves are aware that this could potentially cause them political problems, was that they see this as a part of being in a globalized world. It's good for the economy, especially for the ones that export oriented. They didn't want to shut it down. Even Myanmar later on, when they were opening up economically, and the authors, the author in the Myanmar chapter did, address specifically that there had been conversation among the military leaders about, how this could be really bad for them, but then, realizing that this is what needs to happen for Myanmar to get out of their economic mess. So some were more aware than others, but they all agreed to have it more open than less open for the sake of the open economy. And then, like we had mentioned earlier on, once they realized they could lose power, then this is when the censorship dramatically increased.
Thanks, Aim. Ross, would you have anything to add there, or should we continue through?
No, keep that's great.
So Hunter Marston has a couple of questions. I might minimize that to one. So Hunter has asked, what are the biggest fault lines or societal divisions across Southeast Asia? For instance, Myanmar, race and religion play a divisive role. Is that true in many of the other countries? Are there any unifying trends about what the fault lines are that kind of cause, disinformation trends amongst states across the region?
Yeah, I guess we weren't looking too much at that social media and polarization question in the way that a political scientist might try. Of course, yeah, the Myanmar chapter looking very much at hate speech, as AIM might discuss. But I guess the big trend is just the idea of targeting individual groups or areas around certain identity politics issues, which is of course, we've seen this with Cambridge Analytica, and it's well documented in the West, and Brexit and the 2016 US election. But a lot of this was going on in Southeast Asia, and Cambridge Analytica was in Southeast Asia prior to Trump being elected and prior to Brexit. And this idea of location targeting through Facebook was a really prominent part of how election campaigners would look to use the platforms to ideally try and divide voters, or at least appeal to voters around issues of race or ethnicity. And so that's certainly been a trend. Yeah, anything on that, AIM, on polarizing issues?
Well, initially the fault line was rural urban because of the massive digital divide across all countries. And as those gaps narrow dramatically, and in some cases really, really quickly, then the other fault lines that have already exist in the society, whether it be, religious, ethnicity, and this varies, right? And this is why it's so critical to understand the political context in a local area in each country, because you can use the same phone and the same platform. Like Ross always tells me, it's not used the same way. People are not using the same way. And I think some of the authors use the methodology of digital ethnography as well. And that really is a really critical way of trying to understand how people are using technology, the same one on the same phone at the same time. It could be same gender, same age, same education level, but used very differently because the local context is different. So I think once that digital divide closes out dramatically, you see other fault lines that have always been there. And I think the Philippines article is really phenomenal because they talk about the issue of social media disinformation as something structural that have structural roots in society long before technology arrive. And so when technology shows up, it just plays out in different ways in different society, but we shouldn't lose sight of what has been there before.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that mention, I guess, of different platform literacies that activists draw upon, and now potentially states are using different methods of spreading information through different platforms. Red Tani asks, as social media lends itself to disinformation and disrespecting privacy and other digital rights, should rights advocating organisations, activists, etc., avoid using problematic platforms like Facebook, or should they continue to fight the likely losing battle of trying to change Facebook and big tech from within?
Yeah, great question. Yeah.
Very good.
And I guess it's up to, it's up to them, and I guess that's something that each author would have a different case of looking at. And it is interesting to see them move away from Facebook to other platforms in Southeast Asia. Remember that, when Mark Zuckerberg came to Indonesia in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, when Jokowi, or maybe it was 2014, Jokowi was already president. He did the car-free day, walk down the main street of Jalan Tamrin, and throngs of people were there to meet him, shake his hand, wanted his autograph. This was this great, tech guy that Facebook was really positive and a wonderful thing. If Mark Zuckerberg wanted to do car-free day with the president now on Jalan Tamrin, he would not get that same response. And it's fascinating to think about how quickly that has changed, how quickly Facebook has been considered a bad actor in Southeast Asia. And a lot of people are migrating to Instagram now. Instagram's really booming, particularly amongst young, urban, and perhaps more apolitical, or that's certainly debatable. We've seen, of course, the rise of closed groups here, because closed groups are seen to be safer. You're allowed to express your opinions more. You're not talking with your aunties, uncles, brothers, sisters, friends, and all of the other friends from high school that you added on Facebook back in 2012. So closed groups are now a huge trend in the way that people are engaging with social media.
Yeah, just on that point, Ross, interesting that there's migrations, yes, from Facebook to WhatsApp and Instagram, both of which are owned by Facebook Inc.
Anyway, yeah.
They're interesting negotiations that activists are making to see even those closed groups as safe spaces for activism. Of course, the affordance of end-to-end encryption has helped to provide this sense that there's safety in organising on WhatsApp, for example. But we also see now states, political parties working out, if you like, the mechanics of WhatsApp, how it works, how things go viral, and starting to market their own messages. And indeed, the spread of misinformation and disinformation through WhatsApp has been noted across the chapters. So what problems does this present, if you like? Facebook does still dominate the markets, even if there are migrations to, away from more open platforms to closed groups. How do some of these changes in the way people are using social media play out in relation to this? How it informs activism and the spreads of disinformation across the region?
What are the activists using in Thailand at the moment, Aim? Is it all online? Is it using
Twitter.
Line to Twitter?
Twitter, and to a lesser extent, Telegram. I kind of, at the end of our book, I think what with is the feeling that we're just starting. The states, while they have engaged in various kinds of disinformation campaigns, the cyberspace is still highly contested. And in fact, the states themselves, in many cases, realize they don't have as much leverage against the private companies as they thought they could, and that actually have led to less censorship because they realized they couldn't do it And on the other hand, the continued use of social media by activist groups has also demonstrated to private companies that they do need to care, they need to listen, and changes do happen, even though on the they need to keep using. I don't think that activists should give up. And in fact, the recent changes by the major platform companies in response to not just Cambridge Analytica, but other forms of activism across the globe have demonstrated that they want to globalize the use of their social media, meaning that they want their platforms to be more attuned to regional and local settings. And therefore, I think the more organizations continue to use it and to demand change, the more likely that eventually some of these change will get across. So I will give you an example when it comes to hate speech, and this was, partially mentioned in the Myanmar chapter. The languages that Facebook used for their algorithm to filter hate speech only constitute 50 languages around the world, but that is continuing to add more languages, especially Asian languages, into their algorithms. And part of that decision was because of what happened in Myanmar. Really, was so bad for Facebook in particular, that had, everyone was outraged. So that had led them to wanting to hire more moderators, to hire more local experts who do speak the languages, not just the majority language, but the subnational languages of the Asian countries, and make sure that they use for content filtering of different types of bad content, they call it, do include more and more if they can. So Indonesia was recently added to this, and you're like thinking, Indonesia wasn't there? Like, this is, a major language, but progress is made and slow. But I think the pushback globally, but definitely because a lot of activist groups still use this platform because they know the people are there, and many groups still benefit from it, is good, because it allows for these groups to have some voice, even though alone they might not, but collectively, and especially if it fits what's going on in other parts of the world, that could lead to change by the platforms themselves, because ultimately they care about market share. They don't want to lose users, right? They want to grow users, especially in Southeast Asia, the two largest growing region, Asia and Africa, right? So that's to some extent they do care. So I think the battle has not been won by anyone today yet.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we might want to wrap up and let you know where to get your hands on this book. So the question, there's two from Carmela. I might just ask the second one, Carmela, from the University of Philippines, says that media and politics has perpetuated polarity because of the differentiation of political views. Now that the 2022 elections in the Philippines is approaching, how can we prevent, I guess, political polarization and the spread of disinformation? Are short-lived grassroots initiatives enough to combat, if you like, local authoritarian leadership? So perhaps just on an approaching election, what are some of the, are there hopes that that the authoritarian surge and use of disinformation can be combated or not?
Yeah, that's obviously, that's the challenge for all of us out there, and there's no one simple answer. It's going to take, policy and regulatory reforms, including around digital ad spends. For a long time, we had rules around how much you could advertise on television, and that advertising was reported to Comelec or the KPU or whoever is the electoral regulatory body. There's so much underground sort of subversive campaigning now that, finding out who funds what and how much and during what time period is impossible, even for researchers a year later to ask these kind of campaigners. So yeah, there's a regulatory issue here. How do you regulate without cracking down on freedom of speech? How do you regulate? How do you define sort of what is fake news, which has always been the huge problem in Southeast Asia with some of these anti-fake news laws. In the Malaysia case, the definition was news which is considered deemed, false or fake. Right. Well, what is that? So defining fake news, they sound like a scholarly pursuit, but it's actually a really important one. To promoting quality and professional journalism, promoting public funded journalism. When we think about some of the huge problems in countries like Indonesia, Philippines, US, the lack of a quality funded public journalism which is trusted by its citizens. One of the lucky things we have in Australia is when you look at any survey around trust in media, the ABC always scores, to 60 to 70% of trust of responses. That's fantastic. It's incredible at a time when trust is declining in journalism. So public funded media, but public journalism, not state broadcasting, is absolutely, something we need to consider more broadly globally. And yeah, amongst other things, AIM, feel free to jump in.
I think what the Philippines chapter has shown, thinking forward about, what does this book mean? Sorry about the baby. What does this book mean about, thinking about politics in the short term, right, in the region? And one of the things that the Philippines chapter highlight was, as I mentioned earlier, that a lot of these issues are never going to go away because it's related to structural problems such as inequality, the issue of literacy, but inequality of literacy. But I think that, looking back since 2016 election and until now, the chapter has highlighted that ordinary Filipinos are much more aware of the problem of disinformation and misinformation than ever before, are much more in tune with, what the potential, tricks. They might not be what you think, that there are such things as trolls and paid commenters. The past 4 years has been an explosion of scholarship on the Philippines in particular about this issue, the issue of digital labor, all sorts of number of really good scholarly work. So I think that, hopefully, and also there's more independent organization to for fact checking. Even platforms like Facebook themselves have done way more work in trying to engage grassroots, but also educate to properly use their platform for election than before. So we shall see that, this past 4 years have made a difference or not in your next, or past 4 years, sorry, 6 years, up until 2022, if all of those different bits of initiatives have made a difference or not. And that will be really great lessons for other countries in the region that may not experience the same extent of the problem as the Philippines. Philippines is a really difficult case, but have thought about trying these different things like empowering third-party fact-checking organization, getting more research done, which is already really advanced in the Philippines, really compared to other countries in the region. There's more work in the Philippines probably, than any other country. That has made a difference. And if not, what else can we try? Because even for social media platforms, they're still trying to work out how to do this, how to solve this. They don't know themselves. They're trying different initiatives in Myanmar. They're trying something else in the Philippines. They don't know what's going to work. And with the issue of trying to be more context as well, whether what's going on in the Philippines is completely unique because of this different sets of circumstances, or it can be a transferable lesson to other countries. And I think Southeast Asia, what this book is trying to show is that even though there's lots of different differences across country, there's some similarities and there's lessons that especially activist groups can learn from each other on how to continue to promote advocacy, how to fight back, how to increase more participation from the grassroots despite growing repression in cyberspace.
Okay, well, we're coming down to the closing minutes of the launch now. So thank you very much to AIM and Ross for joining in the discussion today, and of course for editing such a wonderful book. Thank you to all the contributors of the chapters as well. And I've just received word from Ariana, who would like to share screen to show you exactly where you can purchase this book. So yes, that would involve heading to the ICS online bookshop. And it looks like there's a discount for a limited time only. So all of the remaining questions that you had in the chat there, I'm sure that they can be answered in this book. So unless AIM or Ross, do you have anything else that you'd like to add before we close today?
No, just thank you to the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre and all the wonderful people there for putting this on, and thank you to Amelia for your efforts in reading the book so quickly as it's just come out, and to all the other contributors who did a wonderful job, and hopefully this was useful, and by all means you can download a chapter. I think if you're just want to read one country chapter, ICES lets you pay $5, I think, and download a chapter, or you can buy the whole book as a PDF online or order it in person. So thanks again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm not just trying to sell the book. I actually think that this is a really good book if you want to get a broad picture of social media in the region in each country from inception until, until around this time. And it's a good for teaching, also for research. And for me, for example, I work mainly on Thailand, and I've learned a lot just being part of this project about the similarities and differences in different countries. And it gave me a lot of insights into research, but also understanding regionally and globally how social media interacts with politics. So I think it's a really great book. That's now it's at a really deep discount too for like a Christmas before Christmas.
It's a bargain. It's a bargain.
Yeah, $15 Singapore dollar, which is $15 Australian, for something that's written by experts from their own countries. This is our way of also supporting scholars from their countries, reflecting, like Ross was saying, about how they grew up in this environment as well. So I hope that you consider reading this book, and it will be a great resource for teaching and research.
Yeah, thank you both. Again, please do get your hands on it. I've already cited it in an article that I finished on the weekend because it is so relevant. I think it's an essential collection to have if you're working in this space. And I think that brings us to a close. Thank you all for joining us.